So I'm going to first kind of start with just a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll go to introductions. From a legal perspective, we want to quickly read a statement. REBA is presenting this webinar for informational purposes only. The content is not legal nor investment advice. REBA assumes no liability for the use of information in this webinar. REBA also adheres to all laws and best practices regarding competition to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Antitrust laws prohibit any activities that create a restraint of trade. We will not be able to discuss or answer questions on specific pricing decisions or other topics that would impact pricing, discounts, wages, costs, market allocation, or other similar things. Please consult with your own counsel for legal advice. We are definitely not lawyers. That's the point.
Yes.
Two other things. We have about an hour today, so thank you everybody for jumping in. Regarding questions and Q&A, we do have a Q&A time specifically set aside at the end. However, please put your questions in the Q&A bubble that's enabled, and we'll try to answer them if it's organic within the conversation. Also, I woke up not feeling great this morning, so if you hear me cough, I apologize. I'll try not to do that. Donald, anything you'd like to add before we jump in?
No, just obviously a very timely topic as I said on my LinkedIn post, history is being made. So, on the one hand, I wish we didn't have to have a webinar like this, but on the other hand, we're pleased to at least provide our perspective and our expertise, however, however we can.
Maybe quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce who I am.
Sure. So I'm Donald Davidoff. I am CEO and co-founder of Real Estate Business Analytics, along with my partner, Chris Brust, who is our Chief Product Officer. Chris and I were heavily involved in the very first pricing revenue management solution. Many of you know about that involvement with LRO. 25 years of experience now with pricing and revenue management in the multifamily industry. And, obviously we're talking about industry things, not a big commercial for REBA, but we're certainly pleased to have REBA Rent out there in the marketplace as an option as well. Tim, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, that's my job as a sales guy to talk about product, but today we're Tim McInerney, Chief Revenue Officer. I've been in the multifamily prop tech operations, asset management space for most of my career, over 15 years. Whether that was with LRO or with other companies, I've always really focused on how and try to be at the intersection of incredible technology with operations. I think that's where there's a ton of value. And today I'm really looking forward to having this conversation from an educational perspective. Try to help give strategies or tactics or just information on what the heck's going on, so we can say kind of as relevant as we can, kind of across the country. It's not easy to do. That somehow Donald figured it out, so we'll talk about it. But thanks for your time, Donald, and for everyone coming on. So to maybe set the scene just for a second, I think we are here because we're seeing a couple thrusts happening on several different fronts regarding revenue management, pricing algorithms, and just kind of tenant protections, maybe. Mm-hmm. We really see those happening on a few fronts. One, there is a legislative side at the federal, state, and municipality level. The objective today is to go into kind of several of those, talk in depth about those. Then on the other side, which we won't really get into today, is there is, some lawsuits going around for some other competitors. But, really, I think that's kind of another topic for another time. I would really like to stay focused on this legislative side, building tactics and strategies, and building information around what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's a lot faster moving on the legislative side as well, especially in a presidential election year. So that I don't think is a surprise to anybody.
We'll try not to get too political. That's not the full point here, but that might, there is definitely some headwinds or tailwinds. So, Donald, maybe we'll jump in here. So what are the different what's the current state? What are you seeing in the state level, federal level, city level that's really got you interested?
Yeah, so I'll walk it down from kind of top to bottom then.
Yep.
So at the federal level, I'm aware of at least two initiatives going on. Frankly, courtesy NMHC, Cindy Chetty, who heads up government affairs there, does yeoman's work. Her team, God, they punch above their weight. She's kept me apprised of stuff and pointed me in the right direction there. So props to her. Senator Wyden introduced a bill in the U.S. Senate to outlaw. I forget the exact term now. All of a sudden, I'm blanking on it. But basically, it outlaws the sharing of non-public information for any purposes related to pricing. His bill doesn't use the language around algorithmic pricing as much as it uses language around being contributors of data or things like that. Truth be told, again, without trying to get political, I think this is pretty journalistic. That bill has no chance in hell of passing, at least not in the current Senate where a filibuster is in place. Filibuster rules are in place. There's no way 10 Republicans are going to vote for that. Past this election, everybody's wondering, opining, punditing on, to make pundit a verb, on whether or not the filibuster will be eliminated, whether or not it'll only be eliminated in certain circumstances. Certainly, as long as the filibuster is in place, the U.S. Senate's just not going to do anything with 60 votes. So short term, not an issue. Medium term could depend on what happens post-election. Also, Maxine Waters and several congresspeople have sent a letter to GAO asking them for a slew of research items around a variety of practices. So they're not just about pricing, but also around delinquency management, evictions, a whole slew of things. Those kinds of things can have long-term effects. They rarely lead to short-term legislation. And of course, with the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, nothing's happening until after the election on that. But it's worth continuing to monitor. And if anybody in here is not a member of NMHC, you should join, because they're out there watching out for you on this kind of stuff, and they'll keep you informed as well. At the state level, I'm aware of several things. To your point, there are some investigations and even lawsuits filed outside of the civil lawsuit. Again, if anybody has questions on those, put that in the Q&A. We'll get to it if and when we can. As Tim mentioned earlier, some comments around the lawsuit may be appropriate, others may be inappropriate. Certainly, we're sticking mostly to the legislation because that doesn't have quite the same gravitas in terms of what people are allowed to talk about. Okay, so at the state level, the Colorado, right here, my home state, our Colorado Assembly passed a law, or passed a bill, I should say, that purported to outlaw algorithmic pricing. We'll get into this several times. You'll hear this today, right? If you haven't already read the blog on our website, keep calm and read the second section. And then more recently, stay calm and read the details. That bill was very provocative in its title and even its summary section. It was less provocative when you got down into the details. That bill died in the Colorado Senate. It died on an 18-17 vote. So one vote away from passing. And then it's unclear whether Governor Polis would have signed it or not. But, one vote away from that, at least passing the Colorado legislature. And then it's up to the governor whether or not to sign. New York City has a similar bill. It has not made any significant progress that I'm aware of as of today. I heard about something similar going on in Virginia. I've heard a couple others, but I haven't been able to track down any specific bills. And then, of course, the stimulus for this particular session is, guess what? One of these bills has actually passed, and that's in the city of San Francisco. So at the municipal level, San Francisco has passed a ban on algorithmic pricing that uses non-public comp data in its algorithm. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So that's kind of the state of the state, as it were.
I'm just curious, out of everything you've listed, how similar are they in kind of what they're attempting to do, the language?
Yeah. So the good news is they're all incredibly similar, right? So when folks get worried about, oh my God, algorithmic pricing is going to go away, yeah, that's the headline, right? I mean, I've learned through this process from both the Apartment Association of Metro Denver's SVP of government affairs and lobbying, also from Cindy and others. A lot of times the titles of bills are kind of the legislative equivalent of clickbait, right?
Mm,
They're written in really intentionally provocative terms, more broad than maybe the actual language is, because they're trying to get people's attention. They're trying to get into the news cycle, etc. Even the first section that summarizes the bill can be written in very, broad and provocative language. When you get into the details of what's being outlawed, that's really important. Interestingly, I never did an exact word for word comparison, but the New York Assembly bill and the Colorado bill, if they're not word for word, they're darn close to it, like
mm,
more than my reading them could notice. I'd literally have to do a word for word comparison to find the difference. Senator Wyden's federal bill is a little different in its approach, but in its wording, but it's still
yeah.
accomplishing the same thing. And then the city of San Francisco seems to be of similar language as well. This should not be a surprise, by the way, because one of the things I didn't mention is there is an organization out there called AELP, the
Right.
American the American Economic Liberties Project. If you haven't looked this up, look this up. Know your enemy. Okay. The American Economics Liberties Project or Economic Liberties Project, AELP, they are a very well funded, if I'm recalling correctly, they were founded around 2020. They're very well funded. I believe they have a multimillionaire, if not billionaire, behind them. And they go after many different progressive legislative opportunities. So they're not solely about rent and pricing and housing, but everybody loved the massive rent growth that happened in the 2 years post-COVID. The flip side of that coin is our industry got a lot of attention, right? I don't think our industry's ever been mentioned in the State of the Union address until this year, right? They're mentioned, by candidates running for president, et cetera. And so the AELP is on the warpath. They have a essentially position paper that
Mhm.
includes sample language that they are encouraging cities, counties, and states to adopt. So the fact that the language ends up identical or very similar is not a surprise. It's a coordinated
Effort.
attack, even
Yeah.
if it feels a little bit like whack-a-mole,
Well, I
like
think
it's
the
just
good
popping
news
up
is it's
places.
kind of later in this conversation. We're going to talk
Mhm.
about the tactics and strategies to
Sure.
hopefully start insulating ourselves a little bit. There is a question maybe we can quickly tackle
Yeah.
that Mark just put out there regarding kind of Las Vegas.
Yeah.
We are seeing had seen at least a lawsuit regarding the
Yeah.
hotels that have been out there. I'll quickly state that this is kind of it is very similar and different a bit in kind because it's going against kind of a luxury item, not necessarily against like a housing item. But Donald, I'll let you kind of
Yeah, I mean
refine on it.
the basic principles might be similar. And so again, we said earlier we weren't going to comment a lot on the lawsuit, the Tennessee consolidated lawsuit. I am comfortable at least saying this. Um, the Vegas lawsuit, as a non-attorney, appears encouraging for that. At the same time, there are enough differences in alleged facts that it's not dispositive. I will also say the one thing about lawsuit versus legislative that's very important to understand is, again, my layman's understanding of antitrust law. The mere fact that non-public data is being used does not guarantee that there's collusion happening, right? In fact, I'm public with a white paper that I wrote with Tom Beveridge and Jeffrey Roper, talking about how it's virtually impossible to collude in this industry. But putting that aside, what I understand about antitrust law is using that at least opens you up to the claim, and now it becomes something of fact to be determined by the court, whether that's determined by a jury or by a judge. Whether or not that use of data is collusive is yet to be determined. What the motivation, certainly in Colorado, or at least the stated motivation, there may be some other ulteriors, but the stated motivation, even in the language of the law, was basically, we don't want to wait for the courts to decide. We don't even want to take a risk that the courts will decide it's not collusive. In the state of Colorado, we want to declare the use of non-public data in pricing algorithms for rental housing to be a deceptive practice under the Fair and Deceptive Practice Law of blah, 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 right? Whatever that is. So what's interesting about that is if the Colorado law was ever, or Colorado bill was ever successful, it basically short circuits the civil complaint, right? The civil complaint can still go on for damages or not, but the civil complaint could result in this is not collusive. It is not illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Doesn't matter under this new Colorado law, were it to pass, it would be illegal as a deceptive business practice. Okay. So that's the thing. The legislative stuff, in a lot of ways, it may be adjacent, but it has nothing to do with whatever happens in the lawsuit.
Right.
Because the lawsuit could, RealPage could win that lawsuit. All the defendants could win that lawsuit. And if any of these new laws pass, as they did in San Francisco, civil lawsuit doesn't matter. DOJ, by the way, I should have also mentioned there are DOJ investigations going on. They've been public enough in announcing that both civil and criminal investigations are ongoing. Again, those could all go by the wayside.
Right.
In the city of San Francisco, it will still be illegal as a business practice issue, not as an antitrust, Sherman antitrust issue. So Mark, I hope that answers your question.
And so what I take away from this, Donald, is like we shouldn't be freaking out, right? There's a lot of scare tactics out there. We've even seen as far as like office raids and things like that to cause panic, to cause stir. But if you get into the details, it actually is much more narrow or tight in what they're actually looking to accomplish than may first appear.
Yeah, I mean, I think, everybody can always have a reasonable fear of something metastasizing. But I mean, literally everything I'm aware of around the DOJ that they've published so far, they don't talk a lot, but they've done enough to, as you say, try to scare people, right? They're sort of trying to nudge people into changing their behavior anyway. Certainly when you read the text of the New York Assembly bill, the Colorado bill, the San Francisco bill, the proposed bill by Senator Wyden, all of them, when you get to the details, they clearly only outlaw or propose to outlaw the use of non-public data to train an algorithm or to be used in an algorithm. So it is currently very narrow. Again, I'm not an attorney, but I would believe, and attorneys I've spoken to have not contradicted me, if you actually tried to outlaw all algorithmic pricing, you can't use a computer with your own personal data, your own company's data to make decisions. Aside from that, just being a colossally bad decision for a capitalist economy, it would actually be a direct violation of the First Amendment.
Or say,
so I don't think it's like, I get the slippery slope argument. I get the worry about metastasizing. I don't think it's going to metastasize to be a clear violation of the First Amendment. And if it did, I think there'll be a lot of money behind, taking that to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so let's get into the details now. People are here to understand more about San Francisco and what we're seeing there. So do you want to quickly speak about that, and we can go into some of the details?
Yeah, I mean, I've covered most of it. Again, if you go to the text of the bill, if you just read the news articles, that you can find in Google, again, the headlines are San Francisco first to ban algorithmic pricing. Whoa, I can't use any algorithmic pricing in San Francisco. Wow. Then you read the detail. It's what we just talked about before. It's non-public. It is limited to San Francisco today. I think we'll talk a little more about where that might be going in a moment. But the implications are pretty stark in San Francisco. As that bill comes into effect, or as that new law comes into effect, there are certain legacy systems that just flat out can't be used in the city of San Francisco, full stop.
Right. So not only do we see it as a canary in the coal mine here in San Francisco, kind of one of the options is to rip off legacy systems that are doing the non-public data sharing and either do nothing or switch. It's kind of your options. Right. But then you do see this metastasizing to others with similar language, with similar kind of outcomes.
Yeah, I want to be careful. I wouldn't use the word metastasize because that implies that it's changing what it is. I will be shocked if this is the only shoe to drop. Yeah. Right. I mean, for a couple of reasons. In our somewhat polarized political environment, right? San Francisco is not the only very blue or very progressive body politic.
Yes.
So once somebody has the temerity to do it, there's the courage to do it, it makes it easier for others to follow. If nothing else, it's no longer novel, right? They're not breaking new ground. And then the other thing I mentioned the ALP before. I mean, there are millions of dollars in advocacy behind intending to spread this,
Right.
right?
Right.
As I mentioned, Colorado was one vote in the Senate and a signature from the governor away from passing this at a state level. So, I do think as people start to, ask themselves, what do we go do, right?
Yeah.
In the city of San Francisco, you got to move quickly
Yeah.
because you're about to violate the law if you don't do something.
Right.
You can't put your head in the sand, right?
Yeah.
If
You
you don't
can't
have,
ostrich it.
yeah, if you don't have a portfolio in San Francisco, you can't. I don't think you can or should go. Oh, that's a poor Essex, right? Poor poor whomever. That's why I'm glad I don't have business in California. I'll be very surprised if this doesn't spread to
Right.
several other locations,
Okay. This
including
is
at the
a
state level.
really interesting kind of time. I'm going to ask you a time machine question. Donald,
Mhm.
you jumped in your time machine. You go ahead 5 years. Kind of what does everything look like now? What's kind of the scale the scope of all this? And then I have a pretty specific detailed question that might help
Yeah,
getting more into tactics.
yeah. Mark, I see your question. I promise we're going to get to that.
Yep.
Um, okay, so if I jump in my time machine 5 years from now, let me tell you what hasn't changed 5 years from now.
Okay.
What hasn't changed is all the NMHC top 50 and most of any decent size and professionally managed property management companies are using pricing and revenue management software. Full stop.
Full
Right?
stop.
Algorithmic pricing is not going away. It's got too much benefit for owners and managers. It's also legitimately got too much benefit for renters. The focus is always on when prices are up, right? You notice
Right.
there hasn't been a ProPublica article on how prices are down in
Right.
many places
Right.
over the last year. And in fact, allegations aside, uh, you know, occupancies are higher on average post revenue management than pre
Hmm.
revenue management. So the notion that revenue management systems, withhold supply purely to get higher rents is absolutely and completely debunked by anybody who looks at the data
Right.
objectively. Before revenue management, 94 to 95% was typical. Since revenue management, certainly look at the publicly traded REITs who report on this every quarter. They're up in the low 96s typically
Mhm.
now. So we actually help the market by making better utilization of the supply. To continue to promote an NAA and an MHC talking point, the housing crisis in terms of affordability is something that's clearly unfortunate. It's not caused by revenue management, right? It's
No.
caused by lack of supply.
Okay,
And
Donald, let's go into a
yeah.
tangential but still equally important piece of
So
this.
I'm sorry, one thing I forgot to mention. I talked a lot about what's not happening. Let me talk about what is happening. I do predict that 5 years from now, no software out there will be using non-public data.
Hmm.
And the reason I maybe wouldn't have made that bolder prediction 6 months ago, because if the Tennessee lawsuit worked out in favor of the defendants, maybe things continue as they do. But now with the San Francisco bill and the likelihood that it's going to spread, I
Yeah.
mean, it's kind of like how many people in this audience, when they buy software, require their technology vendor to meet GDPR, the General Data Protection Rights. Okay, that's a European Union bill that hasn't passed in the U.S. Right? There are some state things in the U.S., California, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, if it's going on in Europe, it's affecting global commerce. If it's going on in California, it's affecting U.S. commerce. So the reality is, I perceive. I mean, there's a shaking out period, but if this thing spreads at all from San Francisco, people are just going to insist on. I don't want to manage multiple rules in multiple places.
Right.
So the lowest common denominator is what all vendors are going to have to match. That's what I predict.
Okay, Mark, write that down. In 5 years, you get to report back, and we'll see how we're doing. Donald, okay, tangential but still equally important. we talk a lot about the system, the algorithm,
Mhm.
but there's also historically, in even to this day, a big piece of pricing advisory services.
Yeah,
And I'm really curious, and I know we've seen some threats I might use
yeah,
of how that is a collusive
yeah,
process,
yeah,
collusive
yeah.
move.
Opportunity, whatever,
So
activity.
do
Yeah,
you A, what's going to happen with that? And then
yeah.
B, kind of what's the next evolution of pricing services with revenue management in your time machine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. I don't see pricing services going away because not everybody can or wants to invest on a pricing team. I do think, I do think that's also a place where there's a lot of accusation with very little data behind it. Uh, here's what I would say. It was funny. You and I were talking about this just earlier this week or last week. Over the weekend, I was with a friend of mine who's a real estate broker, and I was asking him about the new rules that have come up from the
Yeah.
Supreme Court finding, and he said to me, it's going to shake out some of the wannabes who are afraid of it.
Mhm.
It's not going to shake out the professionals. And he said, honestly, it's just kind of going to be a minor annoyance to me because I already disclosed everything to my customers.
Right.
I already explained why my fees were what they were. If somebody wanted me to do something lower scope, I might consider a lower fee, etc. He went, the one thing it's going to do, one thing it's already done for me now, though, is I used to have conversations with buyers and maybe even help them a little bit before I got to a buyer's contract phase or buyer's agent contract phase. He said, now you want to even just be a prospect. Before I talk anything serious, here's what you got to sign. It protects you, it protects me. So I think what you're going to see is a couple things. You might see a few people taking pricing in-house, just belt and suspenders. Hey, the pricing services folks aren't really being illegal, but I don't even want the appearance of that.
Right.
So belt and suspenders, we're going to take it in-house. Or it may be good for some of the third-party folks like Revenue Edge, where
Yep.
they have to worry still about not colluding among their customers. But the fact that it's separate from the software maybe is a bit of optical, at least protection. But I think you'll see companies like that, and you'll see companies like Reba and RealPage and others who have these services just get very specific about written policies, right? Written
Do's and
procedures,
don'ts. Right.
right? Do's and don'ts, etc. So that instead of having to fight an optical illusion with no, 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 that's not really what we do, they can actually present, no, 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 we have this firewall, we have that
Right.
policy, we in good faith once a year provide specific training, blah, blah, blah. I mean,
No, right.
I'm not sure
Well,
exactly
I
what the
might
details will
add,
be.
I'm also seeing opportunities in needing less frequent pricing services because
Yeah.
there's more modernization coming with some of these tools that allow you
Yes.
to not have to do it as frequently. And
Yeah.
ultimately, if you can then train regionals because it's so
Right.
easy to use, you might be able to extract yourself from a very
I
large degree.
yeah, I think that's a very interesting and provocative opportunity, right? Is a lot of the reason that pricing services is in place is because of the complexity and frankly the lack of transparency in the legacy systems. And so you need an expert to lead everybody through it. Again, not trying to make a commercial, but one of the things that we've already seen or we've heard from early adopters of Reba Rent is that they're getting fewer calls and fewer emails from the field because people can answer their own questions about why the price is doing what the price is doing. And so, to your point, right, if we can move whatever your internal pricing team is doing,
Yeah.
move them to higher order work, that reduces total cost of ownership, it saves
Right.
things. And then to your point, you know, maybe you don't need as heavy a team, or to the degree that you do contract for pricing services, if you can narrow the scope of what they're doing,
Right.
that's easier to control, easier to govern, fewer opportunities for somebody, accidentally to do something wrong, etc. So yeah, I think you're going to see that evolve as well.
So Donald, people are really hanging on to this conversation, right? I love seeing the numbers not really drop
Yeah,
down. They're really interested, and
it's topical.
I would be
Mhm.
remorse if we left without giving some tactics, right? I think back
Sure.
to our user conference where like
Yep.
people really left with a playbook of like tactical ways to make more money in their
Yeah.
business. I know that you and I really believe passionately about like enabling people, whether they
Yeah,
ever work with us or not. So let's go into some tactics. What is a playbook we could start outlining? What are some thoughts that we could start using
yeah.
around kind of all these concepts?
So number one is take the time and energy to read the detail, right? As I had in my blog, keep calm and read the second section. I've had conversations with a couple of senior folks who've expressed that there's like this pricing fatigue in the industry where COOs and CEOs are just tired of all the time they've had to spend with lawyers, et cetera. And there's a tendency to maybe shut off a little bit and
Mhm.
not want to pay attention to nuance. So, my first do is do pay attention to the detail. Do take that extra energy to understand it because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay. I mean, a few other things that I would advocate. Um, Become aware of the alternatives that are out there,
Mm,
right? There was a long period where the legacy systems kind of dominated and nobody else bothered to try to take them on.
yeah.
Now there's a couple, three options out there that weren't out there a few years ago. So become aware of the options and go look at those.
On
Um,
that,
yep, go ahead.
there
Go
is
ahead.
a question that might be related to that a bit. Would you want to tackle that here or later?
Yeah, let's tackle it right now. Why not?
Okay, I'm gonna pull it up here.
Mhm.
What do you think is the outlook on third-party services versus services developed in-house? I take this as like pricing algorithms built in-house
Yes.
versus not. And if that's not right,
Well,
please put it in the
yeah, and I'll answer it I'll answer it in two ways. So the first is what is my thought about like creating your own internal algorithm
right.
versus using something off the shelf? Um, you know, no way would I ever try to build something internally. I mean, even back at Archstone, they reached out to Talus for a reason. First of all, happy path, it's easy to think you understand revenue management if you don't have multiple revenue management professionals. And I do mean multiple, like one good revenue management person is not enough. There's not a week that goes by that I don't say something to our Reba Rent product manager or to someone else where they go, but what about this? Or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So at the risk of, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but I don't think anybody is more expert on pricing revenue management and multifamily housing than I am. I would never do something alone because it's easy to get blinders and you get hooked on this one
You're in
train
your
of
echo
thought.
chamber.
Yeah. And the minute you say something to another expert, they go, what about? And you go, oh gosh, what
Right.
idiot. I've been at this for so long. How did I not think of that? So you definitely want you want a cacophony of voices, not
Mm-hmm.
just one. You also, when it comes to building product, like the cost is not in building the happy path. The cost is all the alternate paths. What about this? What about that? What about rent control? What about concessions? What about small unit type counts?
Renewals.
What
Yeah.
about, what about, what about? How are you going to manage the parameters, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, et cetera? And that creates a lot of expense to build V1. And I have enough experience where we built V1s when we had to in companies I was with. You always talk about getting to a V2 and you just never have the same money for V2 that you did for V1.
Or
And so,
energy or
right.
hair because you
I
lose it
mean,
all first go.
whether you use us or someone else who's built something, if you're building your own, 70, 80, 90% of what you're building is just replicating what's already out there.
Right.
Okay. Maybe even 100%. So I don't get the notion of build yourself. That doesn't make sense. And to me, anybody doing that because of the lawsuit or because of legislation, again, they're just paying attention to the headline, not the detail. There's
Good.
nothing about the detail that says the right kind of algorithm can't work, can't be used. In terms of pricing services, the people, I look, I mean, we make pricing services available to anybody who wants it. I have no problem saying out loud, if I was an operator or an owner, I'd have my own pricing team.
Right.
If I was a small operator, I'd have somebody who does pricing and budgeting and other analytics. But the notion of outsourcing my pricing decisions
Right.
at all, and let me rephrase that. I'm not outsourcing my decision. I still own the decision, but the notion of outsourcing the advisor
Mhm.
is kind of foreign to me. And if I were to do it, if I were to have to do it, I'd do it with a third party because the notion of having the fox watching the hen house, software developer watching, the software, I in my consulting business, we have offered the
Yeah.
equivalent of pricing services. We're able to say things about the software that the people who built it might not feel comfortable saying, right? No algorithm is perfect. No software is perfect. So I want someone who can be really open and honest with me about where the where the limitations are.
Right.
You
Well,
know.
Donald,
So
let's kind of
mhm,
come back around. Okay, we're going to build this tactical playbook.
yeah.
First
So back
is
to the playbook.
know what you're
Yeah.
fighting against. Read the
Yep.
details. Don't get
Yep.
freaked out.
Correct.
Don't go and build your own tool just
Right.
because, right? Know all the
And so
options out there.
right.
What else?
What else?
I have one if you can't think of one. Well, actually, I know you
Well,
can't.
let me see if I come up with it, and if not, please share. I think the next thing is look. I mean, again, because it's now become a bit legalistic, right, from both a lawsuit and a
Yep.
legislative perspective, because we're in the crosshairs, we just have to be more diligent, right? We have to write stuff down more, right? So I would have written policies about what the field is allowed to do or not allowed to do in terms of collecting competitive data. I would have policies about what my pricing team is doing or not doing, especially if that pricing team is third party, be it software or independent third party. I'd have written policies. And then I'd go to the contract, right?
Hmm.
I would make sure that my software vendor understands antitrust, is indemnifying me. I have an out, whether it's a month-to-month clause or some other kind of out if something comes up. I know a number of people are sort of stuck in their deal
Is
right
this
now.
reasonable? I'm sorry, I gotta stop. Like, is
Yeah,
this reasonable to have a indemnification?
I think so. I mean, it's always. I mean, indemnification is just an allocation of risk.
Hmm.
Um, I think that a lot of people have been caught with risk, a lot more risk being on their side than they realized. Um, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's all about, but from a legal perspective, it's all about public versus non-public in my mind.
Yeah.
So
Right.
anybody who's staying so clear of the razor that they're not even in the zip code shouldn't have a problem with a reasonable indemnification clause. Okay. Um, what I would say also is there obviously need to be outs if the law suddenly changes,
Right. Good
then
point.
what I would advocate for, and I would have signed this kind of thing back in my operating days, is okay, if the law suddenly changes, then there's some cure period,
Mhm.
right? So I think as fairness to your vendor, to your software provider, you want to give them some period of time to be able to respond. If they can't respond within that time period, then you want to have a contractual out,
Right.
right? So I would look at those kinds of things.
Well,
Um,
speaking of
yeah.
contracts and outs, can you talk a little bit about kind of the forerunner to this? What we learned from another company and how that helped them kind of get out of some trouble?
I'm not 100% certain what you're referring to. I'm
Uh,
sorry.
we saw that there was a company that had language
Oh,
built
oh,
in.
I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the other thing, well, and I think we can name it. I mean, it's been very public. One of the other things that makes me feel very comfortable in the strength of my assertions about public versus non-public data is, Avalon Bay got out of the lawsuit by the plaintiffs moving to remove them. They didn't even have to get the judge to agree,
Right.
in conflict with the plaintiffs, because they had very clear language in the contract around, um, you know, your vendor cannot use your data integrated with somebody else or vice versa. And so, I'm sometimes accused of oversimplifying, especially because I'm not an attorney, but I just look at the public facts, go read the articles about what happened and go read that clause that they have is actually quoted in the 366-page consolidated complaint in Tennessee. So it's publicly filed what that is.
Yep.
And so the fact that that exists, like, kudos to Avalon Bay. They've created the roadmap
Right.
for everybody else to follow, right? Or, if we think about this, oh my God, all this legislation, all this legal, it's such a minefield. They just don't want to go in. No, they gave us the path to
They
follow
gave us the path.
through that minefield. Yes, it's a minefield, but it's a very clear path. Don't step to the right, don't step to the left. This is how you go through. So I think that's crystal clear. And thank you for bringing that up, Tim. I should have brought that up earlier.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so I think the several tactics we've covered, kind of the current state of the states.
Mhm.
There are maybe a question or two we can run through, but this is kind of, I think,
Yeah.
the end of our of our kind of prepared conversation.
Yeah.
And if there's any other questions, we'd love to have them now.
Yeah, so please put those in there. I'm going back, Mark, the one that you had put in, aside from NHC lobbying on owners' behalf, what can be done by owners to prevent repeat scenarios of prohibiting revenue management software, such as what took place in San Francisco. So I'm gonna say a couple things. First of all, I don't know that you can prevent what took place in San Francisco because I won't get into the debate of whether public or non-public is collusive. I don't think there's any collusion going on in this industry, but I don't even have to go there if there are options out there. So again, I personally am not worried about the San Francisco legislation because it's not outlawing algorithms. It's just outlawing the use of non-public data. And there are options out there that don't use non-public or don't even use comp data in the pricing. I would also add not only NMHC lobbying, I'd work with NAA and your local chapters. So in Colorado, we got connected with the Apartment Association of Metro Denver and the Colorado Apartment Association and worked with them because many of you on this call may know this, some may not, right? NMHC kind of focuses on the federal, NAA kind of focuses on the state. They absolutely work with each other and share best practices. But a lot of this battle, I mean, AELP is not stupid. They know that they can't get something through the Senate, at least under current filibuster rules. So they are targeting state and local. So as much as I give kudos to NMHC, equal props to the state and local chapters of NAA because they're the ones fighting the fight where AELP is fighting. So I'd pay attention there. And then hopefully we went through a number of things, both from a vendor selection, understand the algorithm, all the contractual protections that we just talked about, et cetera. That's what I would do if I was on the operating side like I used to be.
Awesome. Well, Donald, people have questions. They want to get a hold of you, or
Yep.
how is the best way to do that?
Feel free to email me directly. It's just first initial last name, D Davidoff at getreba, GETREBA.com. You can get a hold of Tim.
Yep.
Tim McInerney, same thing, first initial last name. If you forget that, you can find me on LinkedIn and reach out to me through there, wherever.
Awesome. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm going to say thank you all for coming, and we'll keep you updated as we learn more.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. Bye.